You talked about the resilience of nature. Some people are very concerned about how resilient nature will be globally in the face of climate change and global warming. What's your assessment of that, having done your work on this book and other research?
Yeah, so let me explain a little background. So in the book, and in many of the ecologists that I interviewed, so really the book are the stories of many pioneering people who worked this out. I don't work in this area, I work indoors. I try to go there on vacation, okay? That there's a sense in the community that global warming is important, we're going to get to it in a second, but that the other challenges of over-harvesting areas, of degrading ecosystems, of, for example, the removal of predators. Predators have been selectively removed by humans now for centuries. We don't like wolves, we don't like lions, we don't like bears, and sharks are taking a beating in the oceans. So, you know, there are other important things to talk about what's going on environmentally in the world, particularly as in terms of those systems that sustain us, fisheries, croplands, etc. Now, if you take those forces and now add to them climate change, that's going to stress some of these systems even more. Now, in the case, and it's probably going to have it is definitely going to have a different effect between land and water. So one thing to think about is that the way humans have carved up the use of the land, you just look at the map of Gorongosa or the map of Serengeti, there's boundaries with, big human settlements. So to the degree that Serengeti or Gorongosa get warmer or drier in the coming decades, coming years, the animals have nowhere to go, right? They're boxed in. So one of the great challenges is that what would normally happen in the normal cycles of the earth changing is that animals would move to wherever the habitat's better, where the plant life is going to change, and the animals would move. But we've boxed them in. So that is a really worrisome thing. And people are thinking about how can we create corridors that give animals more mobility on land. In the oceans, different things are happening. As you know, there's a great concern about the oceans becoming more acidic and what that's going to do to shelly creatures, shellfish that we eat, corals, etc. So you're no doubt, because of the rapid change, you're no doubt stressing all of these systems. You're stressing the ability of individual species to adapt to those new conditions. And of course, as different species manage better or worse, you're going to change the interactions that take place. And really what I hope, one of the things you're taking home from the talk tonight is how much the world is built on interactions. And that when we change those interactions, what comes out, what eventually comes out from that is it's perhaps not what we like and may not be a situation that will, make the world as productive as it has been for past decades. Many people, commentators, scientists as well, would say, if the Earth is eventually in the long run going to be okay, but what's on the Earth is going to change. And in the short term, our concern is that there's 7.4 billion of us right now, and we're dependent on the Earth to feed us, to give us water, right? To give us air, oxygen. And these are things that we have to be really concerned about. Are our lakes going to be as productive? Are the coastal oceans going to be as productive? What's going to happen to cropland? Just out of self-interest, is the world going to be able to support us when it's under greater stress? So we have to think about the things that we can control, particularly on a more local and regional level, how we manage our land, how we manage our waterways, and then, of course, in the longer run, we have to do something collectively about the warming of the globe. But I will tell you, just a confession, the words climate change and global warming are not in this book. And it's not, don't worry, I'm not a denialist. It's partly to make sure that the attention was on other things that not only do we need to pay attention to, but I think are under a more local control. That there are things that we can do to make our local woods, ponds, lakes more productive. And I think one of the problems, of course, of the climate change problem is that people feel powerless against, the massive global, fossil fuel-based economy. So there are things that we can do to make our environment healthier.
Okay, and the other thing I'd like to ask you is, on a more local scale, I can't remember if the word rewilding is in your book. Probably is, but the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone is clearly an example beneficial rewilding. Here in this country, there's a strong move to bring back the lynx, possibly even wolves in the highlands. Beavers are back, sea eagles are back, red kites. What's your attitude to the reintroduction of species that were wiped out completely? I mean, can you make general rules, or has it all got to be worked out very carefully? Because you can't always work out in advance, can you? You've got to try it and see, haven't you?
You can fail. I mean, you can fail if you don't understand how things are working. And you could, by reintroducing something, turn out you could exterminate something else. And then we've certainly had that experience, for example, in southwestern deserts in America, doing things that we think were beneficial, and they wind up inadvertently. You bring back a predator, and they end up wiping out several bird species. Whoops. Sorry. So it's not something that is, that you can just count on, that if you think what you're doing is a constructive resetting towards some earlier state, there are possibilities that the system is not in a state where it's going to behave the way you expect. So you got to be cautious. On the other hand, and let's put this to everyone under 20 years old in the room. What's your list of species you want to bring back here?
Lynx would be one. Wolves.
Yeah. So show of hands, who's in favor?
Who's in favor
Kids?
of lynx?
Lynx, wolves.
Lynx,
yeah.
yes. Wolves, yes.
Yeah. Opposed? Right.
Right.
Okay.
One or two.
There we go.
Thank you.
So in general, I mean, you cannot do this, recklessly, but there are good reasons for bringing back these species, or certainly protecting what's there to make sure that there's a possibility of rebound.
Okay, now it's your chance. We've got a couple of microphones, so please wait till you've got one. I probably won't be able to get round to everyone, so apologies in advance for those whom I don't get. Okay. Yes, you, and then you.
You said that wildebeest went down because they didn't have enough food, but they're not confined to the parks, so why don't they just spread out more to find new food?
No, that's a good point. There are still some confines. Lakes to the west, big lake to the west, mountain ranges on certain sides. The vegetation changes. They are a grassland species. So, but what happened was there were back-to-back years of drought right in front of Tony Sinclair's eyes, and about 30% of the wildebeest died off. That's a really huge number, and that seemed to sort of reset their numbers right around that million figure. So in terms of that pack that migrates, in other words, so if they're counting within the park, they're looking at the pack that migrates, the density of wildebeest reached a maximum and then dropped off. So in some ways, even if some wildebeest made their way out there, it's basically saying you that the same area of the Serengeti was supporting fewer wildebeest in later years than it was in the peak year. And that's a food-limited problem. A food-limited situation. It's not a problem. You got a million wildebeest. That's a lot of wildebeest.
Yeah. Does every ecosystem have a keystone species?
Not necessarily. And I think, so I don't want to make you think that when I say every place is a Serengeti, it generally, if there's a food chain operating, it's going to have greenery, plants that have some type, aquatic or terrestrial, that are harvesting sunlight, making food, something that eats those plants, and then something that might eat the things that eat the plants. But not necessarily a keystone and not necessarily a trophic cascade working in that way. And I don't know any theory of why there would or would not be keystones. A couple of kind of keystones that we didn't talk about that are certainly in the news today. How about bees? Okay, have an enormous influence on diversity, not a predator, but a really different sort of role in those ecosystems. In the Himalaya, pika, little animals that have a big effect on the way water runs off the mountain, on burrows formed by other animals, et cetera. So another important class of keystones are what we call ecosystem engineers. They kind of, like the wildebeest, they're sort of engineering the habitat for other creatures. But no, not every place has a keystone like that, where there's, one species playing a really disproportionate role.
There's someone up there, but it's too dazzling to see. Yes, you, sir.
They were really some rapid figures of animals bouncing back. What's happening with species like pandas, where there's a lot of work in trying to get them to bounce back, but it's not happening as rapidly?
Yeah, I wish I knew. I saw a stunning, I don't know if you saw a film, it was actually made by a British production company here called Passion Pictures, called Earth the New Wild. At least that was the US series, and it opens in one of these panda breeding centers in China. It's a spectacular picture of all these baby pandas sort of laid out on blankets. It's the most awe moment you could ever get in a film. I'm filling you in there because I'm buying time to just tell you I don't actually know what's going on with pandas. Habitat, does anyone else know? There are probably people in the room interested in the panda situation. Of course, it's a habitat crisis to begin with, but there's a lot of human intervention to try to protect the numbers of pandas that are left. I mean, I can tell you, you brought up pandas, but there are other, grizzly bears in Yellowstone have rebounded about 5-fold. Manatees in Florida have rebounded about 5-fold since they were protected. So I'm expecting that pandas could experience the same sort of, not 100-fold, but 2 or 3 or 4-fold recovery with some intense management over a couple of decades. And I hope that's true. And if anyone in the room knows anything about pandas, raise your hand and tell us what's going on.
Can't see any.
Pandas right there?
Isn't the problem with pandas that they've got a very small gene pool, so they're not adapting to their loss of habitat?
That's a good.
They can't digest anything other than
Great, really question. Let me repeat the answer for those who couldn't hear it.
Actually,
Yes.
inbreeding in a small.
Very important point. So when animals get to a small number, the genetic diversity is reduced, and that genetic diversity is really important for the fitness of the population, the ability to ward off disease, and also that inbreeding, essentially, as we know from human populations, leads to a higher incidence of genetically inborn problems, metabolic problems, and developmental problems. So people have asked me about Gorongosa, what was done when these populations got so small to sort of mix them up. And that's really under active study today. There were some migrants that came in from other parts of Gorongosa that will sort of mix the gene pools up. There were some animals imported from elsewhere, but we don't yet know the genetic structure of what's left there. I'll tell you there's 63 lions in Gorongosa today, and that inbreeding is a major concern. And it's not easy to just bring in more lions because they fight. Prides fight for territory. And so nursing these lions back or watching what's going on with these lions to get them back into the hundreds, which is what's thought to be necessary for a strong pride, that's a big challenge. So 63 is better than 0, but 63 is still an alarmingly low number. So inbreeding important.
Yes, you and then the lady behind.
You were talking about the larger the animal, the less likely it is to be predated. And I was trying to think about applying that prehistorically to dinosaurs. But I'm guessing in dinosaurs, the competition was such that predators, for whatever reason, physiological, predators managed to grow equally big. But with mammals, we don't have any really big predators. Why do we not have any really big mammalian predators? A predator the size of a wildebeest, for example.
Yeah, let me think about, so let me go back to the dinosaurs, and I bet there's people in this room who want to talk dinosaurs. I'm thinking that almost all the largest dinosaurs are all vegetarians.
Yes.
Am I right? I mean, there's some big predators, but, and then the question would be, what was the behavior? If they hunted in packs, sort of the collective, fighting power. In the same way, of course, lions, when they're taking down a buffalo, they're going to work as a group. So either, group behavior was one way to make yourself a stronger fighting force against big animals. But I'm thinking all those gigantic dinosaurs are generally vegetarian. So I think the same principle is sort of applying there. And then you think about sort of the mammals of the Ice Age, and mammoths and mastodons and things, a lot of gigantic animals. And some pretty good-sized predators, and saber-toothed cats, and at least where I am, there were lions in America that were bigger than African lions. So there were, 10, 12,000 years ago, there were some big, slightly bigger predators. There was a bear that was much bigger than polar bear or grizzly bears. Yeah, but not like 3 times larger. And still, you had these big vegetarians that I think must have been out of the reach of these animals. Of course. Then some 2-legged animals came over, and
yes.
Yeah. We're talking about generally very sparsely populated parts of the world, and in the case studies you gave in Africa, the population doesn't have the wherewithal on all levels, from educational to financial, to exert a lot of influence. How ideological is what you're suggesting? If we were to do the same thing in Europe, heavily populated parts of Europe, how would that work?
Well, I don't know about Europe. I think some more predators in New Jersey would help America a lot. But so first, I thought you were headed one way, and you headed back another way. So let me just go to Africa. There's 250,000 people living in the immediate zone around Gorongosa National Park. And I just want to make sure I credit Greg Carr with the vision that he spent as much money outside the park as in on schools, clinics, community centers, farming programs, et cetera, because conservation these days is an integrated process. I know I've talked about animals tonight, but if you don't take into consideration the people, you're going to fail. So there's 250,000 people living around Gorongosa, and that number is only going to go up. So you have to take the people into account, and whether that's and there's important diseases in and around Gorongosa, malaria, HIV, and so there's a lot being done on the ground to improve the quality and quantity of life for Mozambicans. And you mentioned education for a second about wherewithal. I'm just going to do a little bragging. I was just a visitor, but my other job is I run science education for a large philanthropy in the United States, and seeing what was going on in Gorongosa, seeing the science education needs given a couple-decade gap where no teachers were trained in Mozambique, students didn't have the opportunity to go to school, they didn't know where their next meal was coming from, that my organization, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, has invested considerably to develop science education programs on the ground in Gorongosa targeted exclusively to Mozambican students. So you have to look you have to have a really long-term view of what's going to be necessary, what's going to be required to rebuild science capacity, consider the economic development aspects, consider the human development aspects, and hopefully, if those things are going okay, the wildlife have a shot. Now, the park is really important because it's a major source of water for all the surrounding community. And if you deforest the mountain, there's a mountain in the middle of Gorongosa Mountain, you've got problems. So people also need ecological education to understand what it's going to take that their lives and farms are going to be okay. So now you asked about putting things in heavily populated parts of Europe. Well, I don't think, Wyoming was a safe place to put a fair number of wolves. Okay, there's some open area. I don't know where the wolf plan is for Great Britain, but I assume you're probably throwing them all in Scotland, right?
Yes.
No comment. So, yeah, I think people are going to, these issues are always going to be looked at. That's why it took 20 years in America. I can't remember, I think it's in the book, the number of 200,000 public comments registered about putting wolves back into Yellowstone. It was a major political battle. So I assume that depending upon what the creatures are, there will be a battle. There's now a question, there's no grizzly bears left in California. And people are now asking, should we put the grizzlies back in California? That's a pretty populated state. It's a pretty interesting experiment. But I think it's going to happen, just it's not going to happen where there's a lot of people.
Okay, it's the lady on the left. Oh. Yeah, okay. You and then you.
Sorry, I think I might have just stolen some questions.
There may have been one in the dead center.
Okay, dead center.
There we go. So,
About the elephants, because they're led by a matriarch who knows where all the water is. So season after season, if there's droughts, only she can save that herd. Is there any special ways of looking after that specific problem? Because all the other animals, they just kind of look after themselves, don't they? They live by the water, that's where it is. But if they've got to go all across...
Yeah. If you take a place like Gorongosa, there may be people here again who know better. Looking after wild elephants is an interesting proposition. I look in an elephant's eye and I see, get out of my way. So there's no active effort. For example, there's actually a fairly bad drought in southern Africa. I just heard in the last week or 10 days massive rains in Gorongosa, so I'm glad to hear that. But there's no human intervention operating there now. I did hear, it was quite controversial, somewhere out of southern Africa, somebody shipped 16 elephants to a Texas zoo, which is one way to do something. But I don't think zoos are the answer there. I think, I'm really interested in, I understand the role of zoos, but I just think we're talking about natural habitat. So yes, you could try to find ways to look after elephants, but my sense in practice is that, I'm sure if you came by with a water truck and the water hole was going dry and you put a lot of water there, the elephants would exploit it. But they're not going to take a lot more direction than that from humans, to my knowledge.
Well, the biggest thing you can do is protect them from the poachers.
That's right.
By far the most important
That's right.
thing.
A little sub-story out of Gorongosa, about 60% of the elephants in Gorongosa are tuskless. So elephants without tusks occur at a certain frequency. It's a genetically inherited trait. And what happened was those elephants were not shot by poachers in previous decades. And so now as the population rebounds, you have these tuskless elephants. And some think good for the elephants because it means they're worthless to poachers. But of course, tusks are there for some reason. They've been around a long time. I think the elephants are probably missing that tool. But nonetheless, 60% of the elephants are tuskless.
Just a quick question on the numbers that you shown on the growth of the buffaloes and wildebeest, which we saw the wildebeest grew so much more, many times 2 million. And actually in the park in Mozambique, the numbers of buffaloes and wildebeest were pretty much the same on the graphs that are shown. Why the wildebeest, they increased so much more dramatically than buffalo, for example, in the same time?
Great question. Why the wildebeest? Why the wildebeest so numbers? It's actually Serengeti rule number 5, but I was going to spare you that one. Migration. So what happens is if you're food limited, okay, move to fresh sources of food. The wildebeest migrate. That allows them to access food throughout the year. Buffalo are largely resident. Second of all, actually, 2 more things. Yeah. You get a biologist going. It's just like winding up a little toy. Second of all, the wildebeest. So some wildebeest are taken by predators. I think it's about 13% predation. But the lions den their cubs, so they're not on the go. So the lions don't follow the wildebeest herds. They have to stay put to raise their young. So by migration, they're getting away from their predators. They're not essentially sitting ducks. Thirdly, the wildebeest have synchronized birth. So there's this massive spectacle in a short interval of time, I think late January or early February, it goes off a lunar cycle, where 250,000 wildebeest are born, just overwhelming predator appetites. And those wildebeest are able to stand very quickly and be reasonably mobile in a short time. And so we think there's a few strategies going on in wildebeest that allow them to reduce predation and increase their numbers and their density. But if you look across the world at other things that migrate, they achieve a higher density than similar populations that stay put. So that's why more wildebeest than buffalo. And there's no migration going on in Gorongosa. They're kind of boxed in this valley. So there's wildebeest and buffalo there, but the wildebeest are not that numerous.
Yes. Have the mic in the...
Maybe, is it high
yeah.
right? I think the next one was on the high right.
Kind of hiding in the back here.
Okay,
Yeah,
up
right.
on the lights on the high right.
Okay.
I'm helping Clive.
You and then it's so dazzling.
I know,
Isn't it?
yeah.
I noticed that you've not mentioned rhinoceros at all. And I don't know if that's just because they're not in the areas that you visited and not in Mozambique, but I know they've been poached quite heavily. And I also know there's kind of 2 schools of thought with their conservation beyond the community education. And one is the proponents of complete protection, remove horns so that they're not poached. And the other one is controlled poaching, or controlled hunting, I suppose. Putting a price on someone going to hunt the rhino, to maybe the older aggressive males, to control the population that way.
Yeah, the rhino situation in the Serengeti is tragic. So when I was there in 2014, the census was 16 rhino. And amazingly, as we were leaving the Serengeti and remarking to each other that, gosh, there's only one animal we haven't seen on the horizon, telltale horn, a rhino. Thank you very much, Serengeti. But only 16 out of probably a population that was at least 1,000. Serengeti is heavily patrolled. The rangers are really well armed. But still, rhinos have been picked off. So, at a minimum, there's got to be protection because you're getting down in pockets of really small numbers. You mentioned some of the other alternatives that are there. The other possibility is find places where protection's pretty good and restart some rhinos. And Gorongosa would be a candidate for that because the situation's pretty good in Gorongosa, and rhinos might do okay there. So yeah, the rhino is a really tough situation. As you know, the elephants are in a really tough situation. It's quite a battle right now to save significant populations of elephants from poaching. And it's a very patchy situation. Some populations are doing well, and some populations have been really decimated in the last few years. So, elephants and rhino, from the poaching point of view, they're just the number, the top two priorities because they're the two big, most valuable targets.
I think you were going to ask the last question. I apologize to those we haven't got to, but I was strictly told to finish by past. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you for that wonderful talk. I hate to mention them, but humans, we seem to be the only exception to these rules, really, because we haven't really regulated our population, really. We've just kept on expanding and expanding and expanding. I don't know whether
you could have written the last few lines of this book.
That's a great last question.
It's a great point. Yeah. So this is, I think, realizing, regulation's an inescapable fact of nature. Regulation's going to be an inescapable fact for those of us that depend on her, right? So we're at 7.4 billion people. We need what nature produces. As our numbers have gone up, the tax we're putting on nature, the amount of her production that we are taking for ourselves is really large. And I don't want to, I know it can sound sort of scoldy and anti-human or whatever, that sort of thing. That's just sort of the reality is that, maybe I should make a slide that plots the number of humans sort of right along the number of wildebeest. We've gone through that boom in the last century, almost fourfold more humans. So that's a lot of needs to be met. And, we don't have predators, except each other. Okay, I had to say some kind of wise remark. And we of course do have disease, but longevity, life expectancy has gone way up in the 20th century. So, we have a culture that beats back disease, that feeds the hungry, et cetera. So our challenge, actually looking at your challenge, gray-bearded, your challenge is to figure out what we're going to do with this planet with 7.4 billion people and growing. And, I think the answer is we're just going to have to do a better job of regulating how we harvest resources, make our lands and waters more productive, and make sure that we try to learn as much as we can about how those places work so that there's enough for all of us.
Thank you very much. And on that note,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Yes, really.